21 News, your place for politics. This is Decision 2024.
Hey there, we are less than a month to go until Election Day, and you can tell, no matter where you turn on your TV screen, the screens you hold in your hands, tablets, you're being inundated with political ads. They are hard to miss, and not all of them are positive. In fact, many of them have negative messaging, and that is something that we're going to dig into today here on the Decision 2024 panel. Joining me today to go over all of this, whether they're really effective, we have with our Decision 2024 political panel this week, Dr. Cryshanna Jackson-Leftwich. She's a professor of political science, humanities, and social sciences at Youngstown State University. Also, we have Kollin Chupa. She is with K-Squared Marketing and Assistant News Director, 21 News political analyst Justin Mitchell joining me as always, because we want to break down the topics that are really relevant to you and our viewers. So if you look at the research and the effectiveness of negative ads. A lot of people are looking at studies. Politico just highlighted one saying it's hard to pinpoint which ones are really most successful and why, but we see a lot of them, so they obviously are to an extent. So wondering why you think negative ads work. Kollin, I know you work in the marketing industry. Where do you find maybe the most effectiveness for this?
Well, I don't know that a negative, I guess there's varying degrees of negative political ads. So I think like where you find maybe the most success with a message landing is if you don't go too far one way or too far the other way where it's not effective. It's not maybe pointing out a discrepancy in an opponent's campaign or in their track record really. And so I think that if you hit that middle where you're just sticking to pointing out your opponent's discrepancies, maybe not making it a personal attack ad, I don't think that those are very successful. But I think that if you can really stick to the content of perhaps their campaign or their track record, that's when those ads move the needle with voters.
Yeah, they really are dominating this political landscape as we look at our screens, no matter where we're watching, whether it's on TV, on 21 News, on your tablet or phone. You really can't miss it. We have a Senate race where they're dumping millions of dollars into this race. I'm hearing this is the most expensive Senate race in the country. Cryshanna, what do you think in terms of the strategy? Do you think that they're seeing this as, okay, all out, all hands on deck, all attacks, fair game?
I think especially with the Senate race, because, this is going to flip the Senate one way or the other. So whoever wins the Senate House is going to determine who has control of the Senate. And so I think a lot of money from other states is coming into this Senate race. I think the issue is going to be whether they work or not is for the undecided voters. Because I think if you already know who your candidate is and who you're voting for, the negative ads aren't going to sway you. Or if you look further into the negative ads, you're going to kind of see how they're working. So my question has always been, so who is your target voter? Are they working for those undecided voters? Are they something that's going to get people who weren't going to vote to come to the polls? Because that's ultimately what's going to really make that decision.
Is there a potential for oversaturation or not necessarily given the time span that people watch programming? What have you found in your research, Kollin?
Well, I think even from doing media buys on a regular basis, I mean, you guys know it, it's hard to even get a media buy at this point. So at this point in the political cycle, yes, we are oversaturated with political ads and messaging. And so I think that where you're going to find the candidates that really move the needle are, like I said, if they really start to streamline the content of their messaging so that there is a cohesive message. So you have all of these special interest groups that will place these ads. So they're not official candidate ads or campaign ads, I should say. And I think that those sometimes can detract from the campaign's overall strategy and overall messaging. So I think the candidates that are going to come out with the most successful ad campaigns that move the needle are those that have a cohesive campaign in terms of messaging, that they stay on brand or on task, and that you're not having all of these separate special interest groups that are like, oh yeah, but did you consider this and did you consider that? I think sometimes that gets dizzying for the undecided voter, and I think that they're more apt to just be like, I'm turning this off.
Is that what you're finding, or what would you advise a candidate to do when you look at the history? Has that worked?
You know, it depends on the timing, right? Because there was a time where they're like, these attack ads are not working. They're coming off really negative. And now, like you said, this cycle is weird. But I feel like we're in a weird time for elections and a weird time with Congress not having a Speaker of the House. I just feel like everything that used to be what it was isn't anymore. And so then the question is, I'm not sure if these ads are going to work. I know that Ohio is going to be, it's a close race for this Senate race. And then I know, in other districts, like you're seeing these attack ads, we have a congressional race in the 13th district, and I know that it's and as a candidate at this point, it's like there's really not a lot you can do except either put more money in to try to revert the ads. I also wonder about some of the algorithms. Like sometimes if I'm on a streaming platform, I'll see the same ad like 2 or 3 times in a row. And then maybe a next commercial, I'll see the other person's ad.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm like, what kind of algorithms? This is one thing I miss about network television sometimes.
Yeah.
At least you knew the commercials would flow. You're not going to watch the same exact commercial.
Well, I want to ask you more about social media and algorithms and how that is so different than your traditional way of advertising. But Justin, I want to bring you in on the conversation because in a lot of these ads, you will see, and I'm sure you've made some of these ads or created or advised folks to make them, where they will cite votes that candidates have made, articles where they're quoted saying whatever they're accused of, calling out their record in a negative or positive way. Are those credits always accurate, or is there a yes but to it attached?
Oh, they're almost never completely accurate, and we're in an era now where sometimes they're outright lies, and that is that's a troubling part of the world that we live in now too. But whether or not they're effective really does depend on how well that message is tailored. You know, something we notice in news, I'm sure you've taken these calls, I've taken these calls for years, it's a cliche, people say, why don't you guys do positive news? You can sit here and I know what's in the news cycle, and I can count to you, I can rattle off positive stories we do all the time. So it's not that we're not putting them out there, it's that the human mind is wired to be attracted to the negative. So it does work. It sticks to that thing in your brain for whatever reason. But only if, in terms of persuading you, you'll remember it, but to be persuaded, it's got to walk a careful line. So for instance, I've seen some bad ones, I've seen some good ones. There's a lot of anti-Sherrod Brown ads that all come with the too liberal for Ohio, but often the claims are pretty exaggerated, and I don't know if those are landing. Some of them a little closer when they are based on votes, maybe they are. Brown's ads against Marino may be a little more effective, but some of them, like the one where it just shows him in several different used car ads, yeah, he was a used car dealer. I don't know what the message is there, so it's really a lost thing. One of the better ads I've ever seen, I just saw today downstairs, was, I believe it was a Harris campaign ad. It might have been a PAC ad because I could see it on the monitor above. But it was using a clip of Donald Trump promising to give tax breaks. And he said, you know, you guys are rich as hell, and I'll give you a tax break. And then it cuts to a real person, whoever he is. And he goes, well, I'm not rich as hell. And it was a negative ad in that it drew a contrast, but it immediately pivoted to the personal, how would it affect you? Walked a careful line. Most of these ads are not doing that.
There were some of the ones I've also noticed in the Senate race, because those have been really playing a lot. Sherrod Brown started early. Bernie Moreno, they pulled a sound bite, you know, where he was caught on a camera. There's so many cameras everywhere now. You're going to be on camera everywhere. Be aware. Where he was making what he called a tongue-in-cheek comment. People are criticizing him about women and abortion. There's a lot of back and forth on that. You'll see the attack ads with him smiling while he's walking around, and then they'll say not so funny and say, here's some issues against him. So you're seeing really some interesting manipulations of the content within the ads. From a legal perspective, libel, slander, those are things that have to be looked at before you run something. Could anyone really lodge a lawsuit against folks for these ads, or is that really rare because all those boxes are checked before they make the air, obviously?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but I can say that those kind of things are kind of hard to prosecute, because especially if you have somebody on tape saying something, like you mentioned the Donald Trump clip, a lot of these clips of these candidates are taken totally out of context. So while they position that in an ad to be favorable to one candidate, it's not like they can deny that they said it.
Right.
But they can say, my words were taken out of context. And then it sort of becomes a propaganda campaign at that point. So you want to be careful as a candidate of coming across as being authentic. And I think that when you get sound bites, and because you only have a 30-second ad campaign. So if you're taking these sound bites and you're sort of manipulating them to an overall narrative for your 30-second ad, you start to walk the line of it maybe being propaganda and not an actual factual ad. But I think that goes hand in hand with politics.
Yeah, and the burden of proof is a little higher for a public figure, a politician.
Right. They're public figures, and so if it in any way deals with their policy or their record, then it becomes a gray area where it's not really, I mean, unless you say, like, he committed this crime that he didn't commit or something that's really over the line, but it's really difficult. Kollin, you touched on something about just the having to make these ads simple, and I think that's what makes them work really well too. One of the best I ever saw at that type of politics, I'm going back quite a ways now, but John Kasich was one of the best there ever was at that, because he recognized, need to get into the weeds. Don't talk policy, don't talk details, don't talk about any of that. It doesn't resonate in ads, it doesn't resonate in messaging. All you got to do is get a simple message and stick to it. His was, look, I inherited a deficit that was this much, now there's a surplus that's this much, any questions? And of course there were questions, but not in that ad, so the voters were going, yeah, he's doing pretty good,
And by the way, that's an excellent ad strategy for any industry, is to keep it simple. When you get over complicated or things seem contrived, people zone out. They get confused. They don't know what to do with this information. They don't know that, most people aren't political animals. They don't sit there and keep track of how the House voted with this and how the Senate voted with that, and if they're getting along. They're busy living their everyday lives. So that's, I think, why it's important across the board, no matter your industry, to keep your message simple and straightforward.
And you don't want those mixed messages. Sometimes what we find is if you're doing attack ads, what people remember are the names. So they don't actually remember that you were attacking an opponent. They just, how many times they heard a name. And then when they're going, they're voting based off of name recognition alone. So if you're taking a risk putting your opponent's name in your ad. So the idea is we want people to vote for us. To your point, people don't remember what all the details of the ads or what they were talking about or what this vote was for. And so when they get in there, they're like, oh, who am I supposed to vote for? What was that name again?
Yeah, I can't remember. Who's this guy? Who's this lady?
This guy? Yeah. What did they do? I don't remember. What does that have to do with me?
Right.
But it was a real scary voice that said his name,
Right.
so I don't think I like that.
Right. Yeah. That is so interesting to even think about the elements that we put together daily here in the newsroom, that those can have an impact lasting on the psychology going into the ballot box. Talk about social media, though. I said we would get to that. With the fact that this is really part of the fabric of politics now. The politicians are, as much as they are criticizing Twitter and TikTok, they're on it. They're on Instagram. They're here and there. How does that help or hurt them leading up to Election Day? Are they using it effectively yet, do you think, or do you think they're still dipping their toes into it?
I think it depends on who you ask. If you want to get voters, if you want to get younger voters, if you want to, like my students tell me, get off of Facebook because you'll never find me on there. And I'm like, I have to be on Facebook because how am I supposed to keep up with all my high school friends and my parents? And they're like, that's exactly why we're not on there. But Instagram and Twitter, those are ways that you reach that younger generation. They're not watching television. They're not on the television station. So in order to reach that population, you have to make sure that you are where they are. The one thing about social media is that when there are like attack ads or things, people will comment. And so what you find with this younger generation is they can go through and they can maybe find, well, is this true? Is this not true? And then they start getting in political discussions on social media through these comments. And so they're getting engaged in ways that we weren't engaging them before. And so in one way, that's very positive because now you're having this discourse and you're having this discussion and you can retweet simply just from pushing a button. And so you have them involved, but then on the other hand, how do we know that all the information that we have access to is true information?
And fact checked. And are the algorithms planned out? I know you said you saw multiple ads. I think that's happened to me too on YouTube, and you're trying to avoid them, but they're there. They just, like I said, we're inundated right now. Do they plan how much they're spaced out? Is that how you purchase those ad buys, or is that something that just happens on the platform?
Well, you can, but I mean, you can always do like run a schedule or like a rotator ad as well. So then they'll just kind of pop you in wherever there's available space. I got to think with the money being spent with these political campaigns, they pretty much pick where they want to run. And again, we've talked about sort of the reinforcement. If you think of it from a branding standpoint, it's that brand reinforcement of your candidate that you hear over and over and over again. And I think depending on your age and the audience, that's how many times you're going to see those ads. So we were talking off camera about, YouTube, TV, and I'm sitting there watching a monster truck show with my son, and I'm getting served Sherrod Brown ads over and over, and then Bernie Moreno ads over and over. It's like, well, my 7-year-old's not watching this, but they know I am.
Oh, they
know that I'm watching it with him. So you see a lot of these campaign managers and analysts. They have a lot of data that they're looking at, and that's how they're buying their ads. That's how they're placing the frequency of their ads as well.
Does it help if they find folks caught in a moment, like a hot mic or a soundbite, like I mentioned earlier, those helpful moments to maybe turn around a campaign that's maybe lagging behind? Or is there another kind of ad that you would use in that moment? I'm curious.
Do you mean like if I felt like I needed to get a candidate across the finish line?
Oh, yes.
If I had that in my back pocket, would I use that?
Or is there something else that you could launch? Maybe new data, a report. Is that used in the 11th hour sometimes for candidates?
Yes. I mean, I think that there's probably, and we see this happen, like the beginning of the campaign might look a lot different than the end of the campaign because things happen in real time also. I mean, you saw this in the news cycle when we had the debate with Harris and Trump. There was a whole different, like, I feel like, there was an opportunity for both candidates to sort of take sound bites from that and manipulate them and use them for separate ad campaigns. Same thing with the Vance-Walz debate as well. That gave them a whole new opportunity to pick things out. Now you have a whole new message based on what happened in real time in that live press event. So that's why political campaigns are long, and they, in some ways, are staggered in terms of their messaging or their ad campaigns. I think you're probably, next week will be at the beginning of that news cycle will be 3 weeks out to the election. Mm-hmm. I'd be surprised if you saw any major pivot from these campaigns, but you might see a slight one based on, what happens in the news cycle this week.
And I want to bring up the news cycle because in history, I know you work in political science in the department at Youngstown State, and I'm sure you've looked at some of those historical moments. Because the viewers' attention span is short, and we have shorter videos sometimes, or let's say they're on the go, so they can only watch so much. That's a factor. Also, that this felt like the longest campaign of all time. Usually they do by now. Is their memory short? Will they have to be reminded of things? Could something change in an election that we could even see happen here now with certain news events in the cycle that really dictate the outcomes?
I think we could. I mean, we have one candidate that's running as the current vice president, and we have a storm that's coming. We've had a hurricane, and we have another major hurricane coming. That's going to be a Category 5 in Florida, I think, based off of the response, based off of what people get, what they need, or they don't get, or what they don't need. That could really impact the way that they look at this current administration. And if you're a part of that administration and they feel like, hey, we're not getting, then that could impact the election. I also wonder about the early voting, because in Ohio, they're opening up early voting. And so sometimes what you see is as those numbers come in, there tends to be partisanship with early voting, even though people say, oh, there tends to be certain, and as those ballots start to come in, you have people that might say, uh-oh, right? If we're getting more people going to the polls, maybe we need to push a little bit harder, or maybe not. But I think early voting does play a key role at some point, looking at, okay, how we're going to do these last 3 weeks.
And for folks that have clicked on this video, if you're on YouTube watching us, or maybe you're watching us on the app, we are seeing big numbers for early voting turnout. We just had our reporters on the ground. You had Caitlin looking at early voting. What are we seeing? Because it almost seems as if we're seeing a huge shift to early voting.
It certainly felt that way. I was surprised to get a call yesterday morning saying, hey, Trumbull County Board of Elections, we got a line out the door here. And so we were covering early voting, but I didn't expect a line out the door for the first day of early voting. That's something we've not seen. I guess it's a little more this time, and it was in 2020, obviously you saw a high early vote, but prior to that, early voting was really just a trickle. Now, I have seen long lines for early voting when you get a little bit closer, like on a Sunday afternoon, something like that. But definitely you're seeing more of a shift, and the partisanship of it is going to be really hard to gauge this time because it previously used to be that it wasn't a secret that Democrats were more likely to vote early than Republicans. But I think that's a lesson Republicans learned the last time, and they have at least organizationally been pushing it a lot more. And so what we heard yesterday out at the boards of elections were that Trumbull County, you saw a lot of people who were unabashedly Republican voters, and they were wearing it on their shirts, and we know who they were there to vote for. Mahoning, you saw it look the other way exactly. So I don't know that you can gauge as much from who's voting early anymore, and trying to read those tea leaves in the last minute push is going to be tough, because that can make a big, big difference. I recall in 2016, some of the very late stage Hillary Clinton ads skewed really positive. A lot of playing the Katy Perry song and a lot of history they were leaning into. And that might have been a misstep because maybe the pitch needed to be the contrast. I don't know where you go with where we're at right now for that final case for these candidates to be making. And I don't know that early voting is going to tell you as much.
We know that 2016, we also did not have the voter turnout rate that they wanted. And so people that thought they were going to show up, people were not super excited about the candidates, and they just didn't show up. So we had that. I think it is going to be interesting to see with the early voting, especially in Ohio, and all the other states where they're passing all these laws that are trying to kind of, we try not to make it partisan, but you have these Republican-controlled states that are making it harder, or they're limiting their early voting hours, or you can't give people water if they're waiting in line, and they're just like, we're a democracy. Don't you want people we should be high-fiving, like, yes, look at you going out there, you're voting, you're doing what you're supposed to do, what our founding fathers want, and instead of no, we don't want you to vote. Like, how dare you exercise your right to vote?
Well, Paul Weyrich from the Heritage Foundation famously said, we don't do well when more people vote, we want fewer people to vote. Exactly. He said it. It was the Heritage Foundation's playbook back then.
We know suffrage over time. We've seen it in this country that for us to be a democracy, for the people, by the people, that we're but only the people that we want to vote.
And as we watch some of these numbers, I'm wondering, do they find out where they need to send the ads? Certain parts of the state get more ads than the other. Maybe explain that, because we were hearing, and we've heard from reputable sources, that they're really targeting the Youngstown and Toledo markets for that Senate race and the presidential race, because we also straddle Pennsylvania over here at Battleground.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's the case. If you look back historically, that seems to be the case. There's a lot of money spent in this market. There's a lot of money spent in Toledo as well. And I think that they're working with data not only from the previous election cycle, but in real time too, of how many young people live in Youngstown right now. They break it down by that, how many, the demographics of even where people live and their age range, and they're actively pivoting their buys and pivoting the number of their buys based on that. So I think that, we're probably being more saturated than somebody that they have data on that's yes, this is a conservative stronghold, or yes, this is a Democratic stronghold county. So I mean, they get very finite with how they place these buys and the frequency of the buys as well.
I'm wondering, before we go, what you'll be watching for in the ads, and also just some of the things that you're noticing on the trends of the campaigns, how they're going to be successful getting into Election Day through this early voting mark. Because now that we've got early voting and the absentee ballots have been ordered, okay, here we go. But what will you be watching for maybe leading up to the final days?
Well, I think any sort of like shift in messaging, I don't think that you're going to see like this massive change in messaging from any of the political candidates unless there is a current event. You mentioned the hurricane. Unless there's something of that nature, a media or a news current event that could provide the opportunity for a candidate to shift messaging and pivot their buys accordingly. But I'm also I always look at who's quiet, who's not serving us ads, because then that means that they're working with data that's saying they got us, or this candidate got what they needed from this market.
Or they ran out of money.
Or they ran out of money. Yeah, that's true too.
Money pretty bad.
And I think you're going to see that for some of these local races. Obviously, you might see that drop off.
And Cryshanna, what will you be watching for in the messaging from these political?
Oh my goodness, I'm going to go early vote so I don't have to watch any more political ads. But I think to your point, just kind of seeing if they change them up, right? Or we're going to keep seeing the same ads. Are they going to create new ads? I think it'll be interesting to see if any of the candidates come to Ohio. I think, we were pretty much a swing state at one point, and now we pretty much went red the last two presidential elections, and so certain areas. And so, but I've heard some rumblings that maybe some of these candidates are going to come to Ohio. We used to get all the candidates when we were.
Right. It does seem a little quieter this time.
Yeah.
I know, I'm like, where are they? We used to get them all, and they would come to Youngstown.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, what it would take is Ohio to show that it's in play one more time in a big presidential year. And by the way, I don't write that off as being possible. I know everybody kind of talks about Ohio's 10 points red, but Ohio wasn't 10 points red for issue 1 last time around. Polling for issue 1 this time around has a 60% approval rating. So statewide races are not baked in the cake yet in Ohio. I still think Ohio's purple.
And the polls were a little off, especially in the midterms. There was a predicted red wave. It didn't happen.
Right.
And so I'm wondering what the pollsters are doing. And we see the polls, and they're conveniently, I think, neck and neck, neck and neck.
Yeah.
Well, anyone can say within the margin of error now. So I would love to see some of the latest polls heading into the end of this election to see if they budge at all. I really appreciate your expertise. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us here on the 21 News Political Panel. We're going to keep doing these in our nice new set here overlooking downtown Youngstown, because we are being inundated with these ads. We are the target. And like you said, they're everywhere. And you're finding them even with your kids' show on now. I'm going to have to really pay attention to, what is that, Bluey?
Don't leave the room, because then there's going to be...
I was trying to zone out during Super Kitties, and now I'm going to have to listen.
Rapidly partisan little ones.
Right, yeah.
They're going to ask you these questions.
Mommy, who's that?
He did. As a matter of fact, my 7-year-old actually repeated like a tagline.
No.
It was like,
No.
okay.
Yep.
Well, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being here. If you're watching us over on YouTube, share in the comments if there's any other topics, questions you'd like for us to address. And we would love for you to click and share this wherever you are. You can also watch this on the 21 News app and WFMJ.com.